I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for coming to listen to another one of our panel sessions as we lead into 5G week and 5G Realize coming up at the start of September. This one is on bridging the gap between government initiatives and commercial business, and Tony is going to lead it, and he is exactly the guy because that's what he's been doing for the last couple of years as head of program development for DCMS. He's running programs to put that bridge in place. Just a couple of housekeeping things, please, in the chat for the event. If you can keep it to comments and things you'd like the panel to answer. So effectively putting questions in there, and anything that's a technical issue, please direct to Nigel, who you'll see in a reference to in the comment that's pinned at the top here, and he'll help you with any technical issues to do with the event. There's also a poll going to be running, so great if you could participate in that, and that provides some more content for the guys to talk about. But thanks very much, and look forward to the session. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everybody to the event today. This is, as Mike said, is very much a subject close to my heart. The 5G testbeds and trials program in DCMS is now kind of at its midpoint, where we are moving from a model of launching and finding new competitions to run into running more of those trials and seeing them realize their benefits. And so if you think about what we originally set up to do to stimulate the UK market for 5G, to research and develop uses of 5G, and to find ultimately the business case for investment in 5G, those are very relevant trials that have been run so far. The panel, I no doubt, will talk a lot about those trials. But the next question, obviously, is this one about is what happens next, and how does the nascent 5G production rollout that all 4 of our mobile network operators have now embarked on turn from early stage exploration of the consumer experience of 5G into a major commercial success as well. So that's really key to what we're trying to understand today. And I'm joined by 3 colleagues in the industry, all of whom have plenty to say about the subject I'm sure we'll find today. So I'm going to start with Mike Short, the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of International Trade. Mike, over to you.
Yes, good morning. It's a great opportunity to participate today. Years in telecoms before I joined the government at CSA, so it's good to blend some of my knowledge. I think one of the areas I'm very keen on is looking at some of the benefits that 5G will bring both to the nation as well as internationally. And there's a lot of scope to do more in this area. So happy to take the questions when you're ready, Tony. Thanks, Mike.
Peter Stoker, Chief Engineer at the Millbrook Testing Ground. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone, and it's great to be here. So Peter Stoker, I must start with a confession. I'm not a radio engineer. I'm a fully fledged automotive guy since the 80s. So Millbrook's an independent and impartial test services business. We've been running about 50 years. Just had our anniversary, and we're host to 2 test beds, one funded by CCAV, which is for connected autonomous vehicles, and the other is part funded by DCMS, which is was the AutoAir 5G testbed and trial for transport. So looking forward to the discussion and what the future has to hold.
Thanks, Peter. And we were advertised to have Ian Smith, the program director for 5G testbeds and trials. He's had to drop out at late notice with some urgent business elsewhere, and his place is taken by Ben Grubb, my colleague Ben Grubb. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So I also work on the 5G testbeds and trials program with Tony. So a lot of you will know quite a bit about that, but it's basically a research and development program within government. It's about £200 million that we're committing over 5 years. And as Tony said, we're sort of moving now into much more the kind of mid-phase delivery. And I think one of the things that what's been great to see, and it'll be interesting to talk about more today, is kind of through this pandemic and lockdown. I think one of the things we were sort of slightly concerned about within government a little bit was, will there be as much appetite for innovation and interest in this 5G stuff with bottom lines being hit? But actually, I think, Tony, I think you'll agree that what's been great is that industry have continued to engage massively with the program, and we've got so much interest through the kind of recent competitions that I think that's quite heartening to see that I think the momentum is going to be kept up throughout. So, but we can talk about all that in more detail later.
Yeah, I think, Ben, just to pick up on that last point, I think you're absolutely right that we've had a few moments in the program when we've been concerned about capacity in the industry to support the trials and the level of interest we could generate. And I think we had a moment back when we were launching our industrial trials competition when we got a slightly sort of not a negative, but not as enthusiastic a response as we hoped for. That's certainly come back in spades now with the 5G Create competition, which has seen huge demand. So we'll talk about that more in detail. I want to come back to now just to nail us down on the technology side of this. And I'm going to come to Mike. So is 5G? Let's talk about the sort of characteristics, if you can, for us. Is it more about capacity in the network? Is it about capability of 5G in other ways? Who wants that higher speed or lower latency? And what other 5G features should we care about? If you could lead us off on that, Mike.
Sure. Well, as the 5th generation of mobile, it's offering quite a lot more than the earlier generations that I've lived through, from 1G through to 4G. But to me, I think the simple answer to your question, I think it's both about capacity and capability. Capacity to serve more users, more uses, higher speed certainly, but the capability to actually orientate the networks towards different types of users with more personalized or functionalized splits in networks. And the addition of lower latency, I think, is a bonus to follow. I think we need to think about demand as well. So it's not just the tech push side. So I think we need to think very clearly about who really needs higher speed or higher capacity, who really needs lower latency. So to me, the features should be viewed, I think, more of a roadmap and more of a toolkit where not all the tools are used all at once. But this excellent program run by DCMS is really helping to bridge the knowledge between the traditional telco vendors, telco operators, and many new players. And 5G Create alone will open up quite a few new actors in this space, which is great. I think we also need to take into account what's being done internationally. So not all markets are moving at the same time. So we need to compare countries. The UK is doing very well, but there are some other countries that I'll comment on later that are showing new approaches to 5G that we need to learn from. And lastly, I think whatever features you need, I think the comprehensive mixture of 5G with some of the earlier generations of mobile, such as 4G or Wi-Fi, and maybe in due course satellite, they'll all play a much bigger toolkit than we imagine today. Thank you.
So thank you, Mike. I think I've heard 5G described as a sort of Swiss Army knife with lots of different tools on it that you can deploy to solve a lot of different problems. And I think that's very much the way I've seen it as well. Peter, just on that point, in your experience working this in Millbrook, that question of what was the most important feature of 5G that really was a game changer for you?
Yeah, I think one of the things it's obviously critical for us to understand is what is incremental of a good 4G that makes the difference. And I think two of the things that have worked for us, one has been the ability to live stream an awful lot of information and data real time across the network at Millbrook. So that's given us a great use case in what we're doing for durability, in that, yes, we log data routinely, but the ability for the customer, for an observer, and for the engineer to look at the data as it comes in over his desktop is just great for us, and it's become a normal practice. doing things like plausibility checks on sensors and checking high-speed video and high definition as well. And I think the low latency is given us something in a really interesting use case, which was in high-speed rail. And there we were given quite a challenge to get 1 gigabit per second at 160, and that was the initial statement. And so, being a good imperial measures guy, we converted it to 100 miles an hour and said, yeah, we can do that. And then suddenly it was, no, it's 160 miles an hour. And we said, well, you need a fast car then. And then the discussion arises, well, we have a McLaren. So we used it as a simile for high-speed rail to try and see how we could improve the delivery of massive bandwidth, but also at low latency across the network to a simulated railway carriage, which was, in fact, a McLaren 720S. So, yeah, those are the two elements that at this stage has proved really interesting for us and some of our customers testing.
I don't know if you're still doing that wonderful demo, Peter, that I think you were doing with O2 Telefonica, where you drive around a load of journalists in a bus with the video going up and down from the track to the bus, which actually is an incredibly good way to explain how seeing smooth high definition video. Yeah. It's taken from a high-speed vehicle moving around the track at 100 miles an hour and up and down to the bus. So there's a really good demonstrator. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to come to Ben now. So Ben, our UK government target for rolling out 5G across the UK around about 2025, I believe, is the date we're pursuing. So it'd be good to get a government view on how we're doing against the target, how reliant in that process as we roll out 5G are our customers using 5G on the back, the fallback onto Wi-Fi and 4G, and finally, supplementary on this is how will that affect the 5G rural gigabit programs and the shared rural network? How's that all going to add up to wider coverage for mobile customers in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So obviously a lot of the tech is still being developed for 5G, so there's not a kind of common definition per se of exactly what it is, but we know the kind of areas that it's going to transform things around latency and throughput and reliability, as Mike mentioned. In terms of, there have been some interesting studies. So Ookla did a study recently where they've suggested that around 254 sites now have 5G commercially available within the UK. And then there was another one by Omdia, which looked at ranking the UK internationally and found that we came out around in the top 10 rankings for 5G deployment, and that included spectrum availability, service launches, network coverage, 5G adoption, and sort of ecosystem building. So I think that's really heartening, especially because we weren't necessarily one of the sort of really world leaders in terms of 4G deployment. To see that kind of coming through in terms of 5G, I think is really promising. And I think there's a bunch of things that are kind of helping with that. So we've had the Ofcom sort of taking a much more liberal approach to spectrum management, which I think is helping. I'm obviously biased, but I think the 5G program has done a lot to sort of stimulate interest and demand. So I'll give that a plug. But also, I think more importantly, UK 5G have done a really terrific job in terms of sort of building that ecosystem within the telco sector and beyond. So that's been really good. And as you said, I think the sort of 5G doesn't sit on its own, and it sort of meshes in with lots of other connectivity technologies, and the rural gigabit connectivity stuff is very much part of that. So that's about that was a commitment from government for £5 billion to roll out gigabit capable broadband in the hardest to reach parts of the country. So that's looking at the hardest to reach 20% of the country and understanding that that's the part of the country where the market is going to deliver last, and therefore it's where government needs to go in first and try and make sure that it happens at roughly the same time. So that's a really massive undertaking. There's probably around 6 million households that would cover. Not all of them will necessarily need government subsidy ultimately to get that connection, but that kind of government commitment, I think, is moving things. and will help ultimately, because 5G and fiber sort of go hand in hand in lots of ways. And the shared rural network is another area in that. So we had that was a £500 million government commitment, where matched by operators, and it was basically about rolling out 4G coverage into partial not spots and improving services, particularly in rural areas, for 4G. And the aim there is to get 95% coverage of the UK landmass by the end of 2025. So again, I think those sorts of things are the sort of building blocks that you can really start to sort of deliver 5G deployment through. And then finally, the sort of on the R&D side, we'll kind of touch on it probably later in a bit more detail, but through our program, we've had the Rural Connected Communities program, which has been partly about building the business case for 5G and looking at how you're going to test use cases in rural settings. But also it's going to looking at kind of the business models for new and innovative ways of deploying 5G. So again, I think that's going to hopefully throw up a lot of interesting ideas over the next couple of years for how we can go even further.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That sounds like there's a huge amount of government activity going on, and I think a real shift from, I think, some previous programs where there's been a bit of a kind of build it and see if who comes approach, shifting much more to what would people use it for if it was there, and going in a much more sort of scientific approach to that. So, Mike, any reflections on that, on the rural coverage side?
Well, I think the demand stimulus, I think, is absolutely vital, because the investments in 5G are likely to be very significant, and without the demand, they're just not sustainable. But I'd also add that for rural areas, we need to consider the satellite mode in the mix, where clearly we've had dual mode cellular and Wi-Fi for a number of years, perhaps close to 15 years. What we haven't really had is the satellite option. So I'm looking forward to seeing more how we can reach over the sea and in the mountains, as well as the rural areas, with the satellite 5G option. And I think 5G Create and future testbeds might involve more of that. Some of the research has been done, but I'm afraid more work needs to be done to fully include it, whether it be at the network level or at the devices level.
Mike, can you talk a little bit more and just explain to the people in the audience who might not be so familiar, is how does that that satellite mode 5G work? What does it actually deliver? Do I get a consumer signal on my handset from a satellite, or how does it work? What's the experience for users?
So there are some things that work today through, for example, international roaming. So in effect, you can access some satellite networks with a special handset where you can do international roaming onto a satellite network. That, though, is not fully integrated at a network level. The second thing that may happen, though, is that when you integrate the mode of satellite with cellular, it's having the combination of Wi-Fi, cellular, and satellite in the same handset. And that needs some more research work, particularly on the devices level. But we're seeing some interim offerings from satellite companies, which will help us on the backhaul, which will help us with linkage between sites. So I think those interim measures will move towards more business orientated and eventually consumer orientated services where satellite is a full part of the mix. It's not there yet, but I think it will head in that direction. And the UK has got some really strong satellite companies that can help in this process. So as part of a satellite combination with terrestrial, there's a lot more to come.
Thanks, Mike. I think this it's really interesting, because I think I first heard people starting to talk about convergence in mobile networks and mobile and fixed back in the 1990s, and maybe even it actually seems to be coming now. We're actually seeing this convergence thing really starting to motor.
From a development point of view, I think you're right. But I think also convergence has many aspirations. You can combine services across fixed and mobile networks today on a single bill, but they're not necessarily integrated at the network level. And the same is true with satellite.
Yeah, but I think we're starting to see network operators moving towards a single core. So it is, as you say, it's that point where we stop as consumers caring whether we're on a fixed or a mobile network. And certainly the fixed wireless access that we're seeing rolled out as a large part of the 5G is also starting to make a big difference to how people think about the connection they're on.
Sure, and I think the distinctions between wireless and wireline are dying. So even though we call this a 5G program, we need to think about how can those distinctions be, addressed if there are new markets that can be addressed with 5G.
Absolutely right. So talking of markets, then, so Peter, you're a petrol head. Sorry to be without being disparaging. Obviously, this is your world, but is 5G going to be a game changer in automotive and mobility? And if so, what's going to trigger that?
I think, as I said before, it's looking at what's incremental that 5G brings to good 4G connectivity. So some of the things that we've been looking at and some of the pulls we've had so far have been things like public transport safety and security. It's interesting that there's a sign on every bus that says images are being recorded for safety, security, and crime prevention. If they were monitored and then made sort of semi-active, you could see incidents going off as they occurred. So that's an interesting one that brings the bandwidth and everything across. I think also in what we're doing is looking at the shift towards electric traction in terms of propulsion systems and developments in range and performance. And what's going to become critical, obviously, is how long between charges. Are there any ways that you can elongate that time interval or distance between charges? So some things already being suggested is being able to adjust vehicle performance parameters on the fly. So looking at the engine or the motor torque, so it's not an engine anymore. If you're on flat ground, you can optimize your motor torque. You can start to look at the regeneration of your battery, your heating and cooling characteristics. If you drop your temperature by a couple of degrees, does it give you more range? It's because heating public service vehicles is a big energy draw. So looking at that sort of thing, that could be something that's getting interesting. And I think the whole world of vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, so whichever flavor of connection you want to do, whether it be CV2X or DSRC, I think those still are in the earliest stages. I personally need to understand a lot more about what these are. I mean, we're provisioned for both because really it doesn't matter. In some cases, what the UK does, our customers export to different markets. So if one country sticks with one standard, then we'll have to test it at Millbrook, and the same with the other one. So at the moment, we're seeing an awful lot of it on PowerPoint rather than on a powered mast. So that's one of the missions that we have, is to try and change that and get it up and running and understand what the benefits are and the weaknesses and the compromises you might have to make. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going forwards, and so yeah, we just want to try and see if we can stay on top of it and evolve what we're doing on site, but also trying to spread the knowledge out as well. And I think one thing that's come out of the testbeds and trials phase 1 group is the amount of collaboration that we've had through folks like UK 5G to talk about the lessons we've all learned and the secrets that we've done and how to get through civil engineering and so on. So it does have a couple of really good benefits to what we've done in the past.
Tony, can I add to that? May I?
Please, Mike, go ahead. Yeah.
I think if we look at the vehicle as a very standalone object, we're missing a few tricks. I mean, the connectivity to the vehicle has always existed with things like the car radio and so on, but it's never really until recently, with the exception of cell phones, had a full two-way communication set. I think I've seen more and more interest from the services sector in what I might describe as internet on wheels. So where the internet is brought to the vehicle so that the vehicle can be a data collector, but also can access the internet and provide a range of services. So how soon, for example, will we see entertainment live streamed to the vehicle, whether it's audio or video or games or something else? Entertainment will shift. Insurance, we've seen a move towards pay-as-you-go insurance, which could actually be enabled with better tracking of location and difficult conditions. MOT and service alerts, perhaps being notified where the car notifies your service engineer to say there may be a problem here, and maybe it guides you back to the nearest garage or the nearest MOT center or something like that. The data collector point may also enable better safety, whether it's to do with weather conditions, whether it's to do with congestion. We can also see traffic monitoring, where more of the cars could share data to help with city planning and finding the nearest car park space or even the next charging point. And lastly, I think the whole area of e-commerce and congestion charging and payment for parking, I think will also be enabled. So we need to start thinking about the car as being sort of internet on wheels, offering a whole range of services that change the way that we do things, but may add more convenience and safety and passion to the vehicle owner or driver.
So that leads me into the next question, Richard, is back to Ben, to talk, if you can, a little bit about the trials that have been running and are running now in the UK, and not that 5G test person trials has a monopoly on that, but in terms of the ones that we've been sponsoring, could you pick out some of the success stories from those, what's made them successful, and how are they actually driving real service realization out of those trials? And we'll probably come back to Peter on that one, because I think he's got one that's already working on that line.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, we've got a bunch of new trials that are going to get up and running shortly on the rural connected communities and industrial side. But the first wave of projects, I think what we were really lucky with, and it was partly design, partly luck, but we managed to get a really kind of great varied spread of projects in that kind of phase one. So they were looking at all sorts of different use cases. There was a big variety in terms of how close to being commercially sort of commercialized the kind of products were, and also a really good geographic spread. So from sort of Orkneys through to quite urban settings like in Worcester. I think 5G Rural First had quite an interesting project. I think one of the things that they managed to pull out, they managed to pull together that was particularly impressive was the size of their consortium. So we encourage all of the trials that we support to be or require them to be consortia, to include SMEs, so that the benefits of these aren't just going to the big companies, they're going to the kind of UK PLC as a whole, and particularly smaller companies. But that was a really big consortium. So they had 30 organizations that included people like Cisco and BT and Nokia, but also some British SMEs like Parallel Wireless and CloudNet. So yeah, a kind of really interesting mix, and they were looking at some interesting use cases around autonomous drones and farm vehicles and remote veterinary inspections, and other applications in the context of salmon farming and things. So that, I think that's really interesting. Peter's already mentioned the kind of auto air example, where again I think that is got some really clear and kind of strong routes to market in terms of sort of transmitting 4K video to vehicles, and more importantly, I think not just stopping there, but as he said, kind of thinking about how we can use that to think about sort of public transport and HS2, etc. So I think interesting stuff come out of that, and then also the Worcestershire Consortium, which I think at the 5G Realised use case awards came out as one of the most commercially viable when we were first getting going, and I think what that shows is a kind of you can quite clearly see just how you could transform the manufacturing sector if it started to embrace the sort of telecoms and tech advances a bit more clearly over the years ahead. So I think that was a really interesting one, and again a kind of nice mix of large companies, O2 and BT, but also some sort of smaller local partners who are also already using some of the tech. So and led by the LEP. So yeah, so those are all interesting. Some of the other ones just to touch on briefly. So we had 5G Smart Tourism was looking at some interesting stuff around using AR and VR applications so that you can have a sort of Roman soldier walking you around the sort of town centres of Bath and Bristol. Liverpool 5G, particularly relevant in the current context, and that was possibly a slightly more public sector-led initiative, but more looking at kind of health and social care and how IoT can help to tackle loneliness. and sort of help with health monitoring remotely as well. And then 5GRIP had another rural case, but again looked at use cases around sort of smart precision farming, use of drones in sort of smart agriculture, and how you can use that with the improvements in connectivity you get from 5G. And then obviously the biggest investment that we've got comes from is going into the West Midlands. So we've got a commitment to invest over £20 million into there. And again, there's lots of stuff that's getting going just at the moment. So there's and Tony, you'll be able to talk to this much more clearly than me, but there's a new mobility competition. So looking at how we can improve road and rail operational efficiency and traveller experience and things. And also an applications accelerator to try and help small companies and organisations in that area sort of use this technology to gain productivity.
Thanks, Ben. So I'll just add a little bit to the West Midlands story, because I think there's one of the fundamental things we've been trying to address through the programme is the cost of deployment of networking generally, digital infrastructure, and we've been working very closely with the West Midlands team on something they call infrastructure acceleration, and that's all about the another set of colleagues in DCMS called the Barrier Busters Task Force is addressing through implementation of the electronic communication codes, planning, the costs of digging up roads and all of those, granting licenses, and working generally the interworking between the technology companies and local government. At the moment, if you think about it, we've got 500 odd local authorities, most of whom think that they are unique and operate in a unique way in the way that they grant those permissions. Whereas there are four mobile operators and quite a number of fixed operators as well. If they all have to have 500 processes, that's a very expensive way of doing business. So harmonizing those processes is a very important thing that now the West Midlands has done across 7 local authorities. So I think that's a really big success story. I think the other bit as well, Ben, just to go on, is to the both the rural competition, where we've got half a dozen or so projects kicking off to go and address that rural use case, rural technology challenge, to see how you get 5G signal as efficiently as possible into those hard to reach places. A couple of industrial ones as well, where we've got some really interesting industrial ones following on from the Worcestershire trial, and again scaling that up to a higher level. So I think those are all going well. We've also got a trial we're doing with Korea, with the Korean equivalent to UK 5G, and Cisco working on media delivery to metro transport. So that transport experience, lots and lots more to come. So I'm going to come to, thank you for that then. So I'm going to come back to Peter. So you're actually continuing to run this live 5G network at Millbrook. Is that a niche use case, or is this something which you think other industries can benefit from? In other words, this whole private network idea that is, I think, seen quite by the industry as something that they want to try and explore and understand. Some will see it as a threat, and some will see it as a massive opportunity. But do you think it's niche for you, or do you think are you hearing from other organisations that want to get involved?
Yeah, I think with a private network, we're seeing it as something that's a good thing, certainly for our business, because we're a confidential site, and so the ability to move your data around and keep it confidential, it doesn't leave the site because we have our own core on site. We can let it out through a door if we need to, but most of the time, and a lot of our customer base is quite pleased about that they have very sensitive data, both visual and electronic, that just cannot leak anywhere. And I'm not degrading any security anywhere in other systems, but it gives that degree of confidence. I think also, being a private network, we can do things here that you just can't do in public. So we have a lot of sites around Millbrook. So we have something around about 89 radios on 59 masts. around the 700 acres. So it's a very dense network. But we do have the ability to turn it on and turn it off, turn it up and turn it down, to do experimentation for people that are testing devices and services that need good coverage, weak coverage, test handovers, and so on. So for us as a private network, it's given us that great amount of control. I think also we're evolving the ability to slice and dice, and start looking at the slicing of things and potentially giving each potential customer a unique experience with their own identifier on their devices. So for events and so on, you can have car brand X that's showing up in your handset rather than an MNO. So that is potentially interesting and good for branding. But I think we're just part of we're kind of an outdoor part of the whole production process in test and development. So it does fit in with the industry 4.0 and private networks within manufacturing and other industries. We just happen to be outdoors. Having said that, we're looking quite hard at indoors now and trying to get into those hard to reach areas that are away, and we supplement that by small cells or whatever we need to do. And I think the other thing that we're also working on at the minute is neutral hosting. So the ability to use one set of hardware and just give others access to those services, having the private network and being able to experiment in that sort of closed way is quite good, and it's really very tempting. So yeah, I think it's here to stay. It will evolve. It depends what the customer demand is and how the industry progresses. But yeah, the key thing is to be flexible and stay alert as to what's happening and go with it, really.
Thanks, Peter. That's a really, because I always think of your process as being, it's like a part of a factory process, really. Yep. It's just you've gone outside the factory.
Yeah.
Mike, there's a question on the chat you might want to pick up, which is, what do you think of dynamic spectrum sharing of LTE and 5G? How's that going to affect the industry? Does it work? What's the experience of it around the world?
Well, the experience around the world is very limited. It's early days in the USA when they consider it. It's early days generally. I think it's another toolkit element that may come in subject to regulation. As a toolkit element, I think it needs to be fit for purpose against a range of tools. Also, when you get into dynamic spectrum sharing, you've got to think about the cost of the networks. If you are sharing the spectrum, you might multiply the cost of the networks and overall the costs go up. So it's got some benefits, but it has risks of some downsides. Traditionally, public licensees have been licensed nationally, and that means that they're responsible for the quality of their service. If you start to get into more sharing, there become more excuses, perhaps, against the quality of service. So it's a tool that will emerge in time with the releases that are defined by ETSI 3GPP, but I don't think it's the only tool in the toolkit to be jumping at straight away.
And there were a couple of comments on the earlier points about satellite, Mike. You were describing how the satellite process works. And a couple of comments, I suppose, rather than questions, but maybe worth a quick comment. Roaming on satellite will drain your bank account pretty fast, and another one suggesting that it'll also hit your battery. I guess that's all about business models and battery tech, isn't it?
Yes, I can address both. I mean, over time, the costs of cellular have fallen dramatically since the 1980s, and I'm sure with innovation we'll see other cost falls in satellite as well. The key is to get the volume and also the right cost profile of the satellite industry to make sure it can meet the demand. The early areas of demand using satellite might be more business orientated for those who need to go to remote places first, and in time it will come towards the consumer. But I'm not suggesting that we have cellular level pricing for satellite straight away for either business or consumer services. But the innovation needs to take place to see whether we can combine and reach lower cost levels with satellite as well. Whether it's a battery drain issue or a cost issue, innovation can help. And on the battery front, clearly I'm not always expecting them to be handhelds the way we know cellular today. Clearly, people are always very careful about the energy consumption, whether it's for Wi-Fi or cellular, and I think the same would apply to satellite. But you might have satellite based on a power source that could be in a vehicle, for example. You might have a power source that comes from perhaps a fixed location rather than being a fully mobile location. But for remote areas, whether it's over the sea, over the mountains, or remote rural, satellite will play a part, even if there are cost and battery challenges ahead.
Thanks. That's very, very clear, Mike. Ben, there's another question on the live stream here, and this is very much in your backyard in terms of cross-government collaboration. What goes on behind the scenes with DCMS sharing with other government departments on the benefits of 5G and digital transformation using it? In other words, how does it step towards industry, enterprise coming to industry with, I hear you can help me with? In other words, are we using this? Are we eating our own dog food? To use a horrible expression, I think drinking our own champagne is a better one. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a massive part of what we do. So the program, we've got a big thrust. It's obviously not just funding trials and delivering them, but actually kind of harvesting the benefits, figuring out what works, what doesn't, and then sharing those internally. So a lot of our, for example, we work quite closely with our colleagues in DEFRA to try and share the learnings from the rural projects that we've already got up and running on the kind of the different industry and vertical sector use cases that are coming out of that, and the ones that are particularly commercially viable. And we're expecting to do a lot more of that with kind of RCC, rural connected communities. And equally, working with colleagues in BASE and MHCLG, who are also working with local authorities on smart city initiatives, taking the things that we've seen that work or not work in the West Midlands and kind of sharing that with them to make sure that we don't sort of run into the same traps again, or that we copy best practice where it is. So yeah, that's a massive part of what we do.
I'd agree with that, and I'm seeing increasingly when I'm seeing policy papers and initiatives coming through, the drive to join things up is much stronger and getting keener by the day. I think we're definitely seeing that across our whole program. Okay, so let's go to the next question, and I'm just going to ask Mike: is the UK a leader or a laggard, or is it somewhere in between? Is China running away with 5G and from everybody else? What's your view of the sort of the international viewpoint, the international landscape for 5G?
So my headline answer is I think we're a leader, as evidenced by Ben's point earlier on that we're in the top 10. I think we should just acknowledge, first of all, internationally, the markets are different. There are stages of growth, there are different stages of adoption, the markets are different. So just to take 4 examples, China is clearly in a head start position by volume. So we are going to see the highest volumes in China, big country. They've chosen for capacity reasons and strategic leadership reasons that they want to be a leader in 5G. So whatever we do, it's unlikely we're going to be as big as China. If we take, they clearly are specializing in fixed wireless access, so less of the mobility story to do with 5G, but much more in terms of how can big operators compete outside of their home territories with fixed wireless access delivery. South Korea, a pioneer in this place, a pioneer in terms of new approaches to 5G, and we need to watch and learn from them. Japan, we were expecting to see a lot more in the Olympics this year, but I'm sure we'll see it next year. Japan are also a pioneer, particularly in terms of some of the Open RAN trials at scale, which are very significant. But closer to home in Europe, I think we watch the larger countries. And I think we, apart from Switzerland, who might claim to be the first in Europe, I think we might claim to be up there with the best in Europe. And I think when we compare ourselves to Germany or France, we're really well placed. So I would say we're one of the leaders. I think we need to maintain that position. So I think in order to maintain it, it's not just the grateful support from DCMS, but also it's thinking about longer term R&D, thinking about the softwareization of networks, whether it's to do with Open RAN or SDN or some of the other acronyms you may choose. We need to think about how we maintain that leadership position. And I think that requires us to keep our foot on the trials and testbed throttle, but also to think about the longer term as well.
You've mentioned the a term there a couple of times, the Open RAN or Radio Access Network. Can you unpack that a little bit for us and just explain what it is and what the UK companies and market is doing about it? When do you expect to see it making an impact?
Sure. So I think one of the leaders in Open RAN is a company called Altiostar, who's actively deploying Open RAN at scale. It's opening up the radio access network into having separate hardware and software and maybe separate services layers. This is not fully standardized yet, and as such, we have to tread with care that we shouldn't really do things until they are standardized. Otherwise, you might have some benefits of Open RAN, but be locked out of further choice. So having some standards in this area is really the critical part. What we also see, though, is that the Trials and Test Beds program open up the opportunity to trial Open RAN going forward, which could reduce the cost of radio access equipment. So there is a prize here that is beneficial. And certainly big companies like Vodafone and Telefonica have been trialing Open RAN in their own right, but they're largely, I think, apart from the trials, waiting for standardization to occur. I think then the question is, what is the role of government in this area? And I could see a good case to compare Open RAN systems to see what benefits they could bring to the UK, whether it be in terms of lowering cost or in terms of design and manufacturing capability, or maybe in terms of getting broader city coverage initially rather than rural coverage. We can start to see a trend towards small cells, so that has to be part of the mix. Open RAN at a lower cost might be easier to put onto lampposts or other street furniture. We can also see it part of a broader softwareization initiative, including network functions virtualization and the softwareization of core networks. There's a lot to do in this area, which is not yet going to be seen by consumers for a little while yet, even if trials are due to start soon.
Thanks for that, Mike. Can I just draw the attention of the audience to the polls tab and just ask if people could register their votes on the current poll that's up there. There's quite an interesting set of positions emerging on what do we see as the biggest challenge to taking government initiatives to commercial success. While you're doing that, I'll ask Ben to just comment on where we are in terms of vendor diversification. One of the things that was recommended by the network supply chain review, which was conducted and reported fairly recently. Where are we in that vendor diversity process? What's government's objective? And can you just talk about what the idea of it is and what role also 5G test beds and trials is playing in it?
Yeah, and I guess that was all set out very clearly in the telecom supply chain review and the response to that. So I won't comment on too much of the detail there. Yeah, I mean, I think what's clear is we need more diversity in supply chain and telecoms in the UK. As the government, we've said that we need to play a part in helping to bring that about, and research and development can play an important role. So through our 5G test bed and trials program, we're already doing quite a lot of that. Some of our trials are already testing sort of innovative models and supporting some of those kind of smaller vendors that might help to disrupt the market. Yeah, so kind of doing a range of things. And I guess the other thing is that in all of our competitions, we look to encourage the projects and trials that we support to sort of rely on open, interoperable network architectures. So again, kind of feeding into the kind of benefits of Open RAN that Mike's already sort of talked about. So there will be more to come in this space, I'm sure, but certainly something we're already supporting through the current program. Thanks for that,
Ben. So Peter, can we come to devices in your market for a moment? What 5G devices does your business depend on, and what sorts of things do you require to make it work? Has the supply chain kept up with your business needs? How do you see your network and services evolving as it goes forward? And have you got any challenges with that supply chain actually working with you that are perhaps obviously the obvious question is around COVID as well. So you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, our daily activities in what we do rely on sort of data loggers and sensors. So whether they're video, they're radar, they're LiDAR or ultrasonics, we measure a lot of temperatures, we measure a lot of movements, accelerations and gases and those sorts of things. So getting those connected and able to work across these new sort of services is quite a challenge because, again, it's a conservative industry. All this stuff is quite new, and building and getting signals out and across the network, has been a challenge. We're starting to work our way around it. We've used some initial fixes. The good thing we have is we have a good network of small cells, and so that's worked rather than large macros. Although actually we are looking at macros coming on site as well. And using different parts of the ecosphere, I think. So we're using sub 6 gigahertz for a lot of the normal activities around the track. But again, the case I mentioned, the high-speed rail, the collaborators with us, Blue Wireless, are running at 70 gigahertz millimeter wave, which has been quite new for us. We didn't really understand what it was all about, not being radio engineers. And it's been through 2 iterations. It's operated at 60 gigahertz and then it operated at 70, which gave them much better range. And that's quite significant because if you increase the range, then you're reducing the amount of hardware you're going to have to deploy in infrastructure. So that's been a sort of a key lesson. So we need to still push to the connectivity side of things and make sure more and more of the devices we use on a daily basis and our customers and our industry uses become adapted to the new networks and make sure there's enough interface devices across there. And I think also evolving on how we evolve as a test bed. So the key things that are starting to become important for us, as I said earlier, we're going to be probably looking at installing some macro sites. The systems that we have, we don't do 3G, so we need to have some 3G backstops on site for that. Looking at solar power for remote areas where there's no power of their own and fiber, and that's a real interesting development on that one as well. And I think the goal is eventually to deploy a 5G standalone network. What's obviously happened is the current uncertainty and climate has meant that a lot of investment and timing decisions due to social distancing, etc., have meant that plans are still a little bit in flux. I mean, it's very difficult to manhandle something that takes 2 people to carry if you can not have those 2 people very close together. So we're still looking on that as to how we work around the physical site. But yeah, going forward, I think obviously the mobile devices, SIMs in vehicles have now been standard since I think it was April 2018. We'll start looking at the eCall provision in all new vehicles. So we have now connected vehicles running around, every new vehicle's connected. Looking at the services that are coming off that and how that adapts into 5G as well. And not necessarily just focusing on the passenger car side. There's an awful lot of work going on public transport, on buses, on trucks and freight movement and so on. So there's a whole ecosystem out there just starting to get looking at. So looking at platooning as well, did some initial trials on heavy goods vehicle platooning. So all of these things are starting to move up, and I think we've seen a big acceleration in use cases, and it's having that network on site, having the awareness and saying to people, do you realize what you can do with a private network, with this high speed, the bandwidth, the latency and so on. And it's just trying to kickstart the imagination of folks into what they can do. And I think of all the use cases we've looked at, there's probably only one that I'm still not very happy about contemplating, and that's the live remote surgery. I think maybe when it gets a bit better developed, we might look at that one. But that's the one we sort of hesitate a little bit. But most of the other ones we're pretty anxious to take on and keen to see how they develop.
I think that's really, really interesting observation. That on the surgery front, you'd be amazed at how much robotic surgery already goes on in the NHS and elsewhere worldwide. I take your point though that if you are going to have the surgeon who's kind of monitoring the operation remote from the robot, you want to have an incredibly reliable connection, hence
Yes.
the 5G piece.
Yeah.
So that, I think that's really, really fascinating insight. And so Peter, we chatted previously about the business model in Millbrook and what it is that's attractive to the motor manufacturers about the use case there. And I think I'd gone in sort of thinking that it must be quite expensive just to use the track itself. But actually, I think you've told me that it's not that so much as the cycle time for the manufacturer. Do you want to just kind of drill into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a hint as to what's sitting behind Ben, and that's a big clock that ticks. It's time. It's not so much the expense of doing a test. It's the time dependency that you have. I mean, traditionally, what's happening now in the auto industry is the number of physical prototype vehicles that you have to test a new vehicle program on is reduced. And much more use is made of using the same vehicle on a shared basis. So one day it can be doing a cooling test, the next day a fuel economy, the next day an EMC or whatever it is. And so the pressure is on to maximize that time on test. So previously you would have something that logged an awful lot of data, gigabits and gigabits of it, and the engineer would review it afterward. So after the test had finished and before the next test ran, maybe the same day, maybe the next day, and then you discover there's something wrong, there's a sensor gone down, or you've missed a connection, or something's not reading quite right, or it indicates an issue that you need to work on. You would find that perhaps later in the shift or the next day or even the next week. To do it real time gives you that pause, that check, that plausibility check. Let's stop the test now, fix that sensor. Right, it's working, let's continue. Let's just do that drumbeat of test, assess, test, and assess, but do it much, much quicker. And then the problem might be the next day that it rains or it's dry, depends on what test you're doing, the car's needed for the next test and so on. So that the criticality is that ticking clock that's always there. So it's not so much hours on track, it's being able to have access to a vehicle and a test piece for a particular time, and then making sure that you maximize the use of that time and you're not sitting around waiting for something to download or some piece of software to work something out. If you can do it real time, it's great. We've placed cameras in containers and watched how they go around tracks as well, and that's much better than opening the door and finding out what's going on afterwards. So
yeah. And Mike, this is sort of, I mean, obviously this is a really critical factor for UK productivity, I think, across industry. Are you seeing similar this sort of shift towards the mobile private network supporting industry? Obviously, industry is, the manufacturing industry is it going to be a fast enough adopter of this technology, or is it going to take time, or a long time before industry will adopt? Or are you seeing movements already?
So I'm seeing movements to private networks already, but let me characterize these slightly differently. I think internationally, private networks are not widely used. The UK has a head start in this area already, even with 2G and 3G and 4G or virtualized fixed networks. So we need to think a little bit about our head start in private networks. I think we can also see that there have been mega shifts from what might be described as the private mobile radio world to the cellular world, and that's more visible in the UK than it is in many other countries. I think we can also see that in the UK we've got some real strengths in security, which has helped the shift towards private networks in the UK already. So to me, it's less about expansion of private networks in the UK and more about expansion of private networks internationally. How can they become more relevant as an export opportunity, as well as building on the capability in the UK? And if I was to elaborate a little bit, I mean, I think we already have, for example, more shared networks in the UK than many other countries. We certainly have a high percentage of shared sites, and certainly the model of SRN, Shared Rural Network, to me is a very innovative model. But going forward, I can see a need for more neutral host type locations, which aren't so much private, but shared. And that could be for cities. We can't all put 5G base stations on every lamppost. It needs to be a shared deployment. So you might start to imagine that as being neutral hosts in cities rather than necessarily private networks. You might imagine perhaps the same would apply in shopping malls, but they could be called private networks. So we need to really look at perhaps private networks and neutral hosts together. We can certainly see in the case of campuses or industrial estates, there are some shared networks there today, but they're not necessarily private networks or necessarily neutral hosts today, but they may become that. We can see also in IoT, the Internet of Things, a need for common test beds. It may be that for certain reasons, you don't want just one network, you want to be across all the networks that are available, the Internet of Things at scale. You might, for labs or test tracks such as Millbrook, want the same sort of thing. So I think the orientation towards one network, whether it's public or private, or a neutral host, which might be shared, I think we're going to see a lot of change. But let me stress, as I did at the beginning, we already have some leadership in private networks in the UK based on what's already been done with Wi-Fi and cellular and fixed networks. So I think we should build on our strengths. And just to go back briefly to Peter's points, I think it's quite useful to put this in an international context. It's likely that we see around 100 million 5G connections by the end of this year, and perhaps 1 billion by 2025. So a lot of the attention will be on the growth in volume rather than in the growth in value. And I think the private network space needs to be looked at carefully against, is it volume or is it value?
Thanks. I think it's a good assessment. Ben, let me come to you because we're also in this context of talking about sectors where adoption is going to be important. 5G creates competition. Obviously, the name implies that creative industries are going to be of interest. I understand. Perhaps you can just talk about the competition a little bit and where you think it might impact the creative industries as well as others.
Yeah, so it's a £30 million. We committed up to £30 million when we launched it, and it's open to all sectors. So there is no bias there, and indeed bids from kind of local authorities and research organisations, etc. But certainly, sort of in crafting it and sort of thinking about engagement, we're conscious that we want to support industries and sectors that where A, the UK has a competitive advantage, and B, we think there are some real kind of tangible commercializable opportunities around 5G. And the creative sectors is absolutely one of those. So there are sort of big opportunities around AR and VR, particularly in production and gaming and things like esports. And we're also conscious that for companies that are dealing with media and entertainment, the sort of low latency and high quality of telecommunications that they need, particularly when, for example, it comes to live experiences, makes 5G a potentially very good fit and something that could drive the UK forward. We're already a leader in the creative sector in lots of ways. And if we can sort of think clearly as a country about how 5G can further enhance that, then there's some real opportunities. So yeah, so the competition is open to all sectors, but that is certainly a sector that we're interested in, and it's part of a wider government policy. So we've got the industrial strategy, for example, and the creative industry sector deal, both of which we're sort of very crystal clear that we need as a country to encourage innovation in the creative sector. We can't rest on our laurels, and we need to make sure that the kind of advantage that we've got there is pressed home in the years ahead.
Yeah, and I saw that the Secretary of State's been busy with the Creative Industries Task Force as well, and they've come forward with a really good settlement with the Treasury. Numbers are significant, I think, in terms of supporting the creative industry sector. So in terms of creative industries opportunities, we've obviously seen over the last 10 or 15, 20 years, people talking about immersive technologies like augmented and virtual reality, mixed reality, all sorts of different things people are coming up with. Open question to the panel, anyone can answer and jump in. Are those gimmicks and fads, or are they genuine, real, usable technologies where it's going to actually have a real commercial impact on the way we operate, we work, and we are entertained? open question. Anybody can jump in.
So I think it does have the potential to sort of transform things. I mean, there's the kind of obvious, as I mentioned, the kind of tourism sector advantages and in the creative, but also we saw sort of use in this within manufacturing in our Worcester Bosch trial, where they were looking at kind of remote maintenance, where you could have perhaps an engineer who is more qualified but working remotely and guiding a more inexperienced colleague to kind of repair products. So I think there's a lot of potential there for innovation in lots of sectors.
Any other bids?
Just add a bit more. Go on, Peter.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that really appealed to me. I think it was something I saw at 5GIC was the concept of holoportation, where your 3D self appears in a meeting room from your home environment. So I thought that was particularly interesting as a kind of a mixed reality situation. Being selfish about it, I'd love to be able to test vehicles against virtual targets. If we start looking towards autonomous vehicles, we're going to have to do some pretty scary scenarios, and I'd rather do that with virtual trucks on a real track than real trucks. So yeah, it does hold some great potential, and once you see where that sort of stuff starts to go, then your imagination just sets running. I think, agree with Ben, the remote expert is really very relevant in being able to do that from a distance as well. So yeah, it's changing.
Yeah. Mike?
I think also the area of training alongside simulation, I think, is very important. Imagine what it could do for policemen or firemen before they have to go into a difficult situation. So it's a form of simulation that may help with their training. If we imagine doing that in the health sector, you could also imagine how it might help with planning operations that are difficult operations. So I think there is still more work to be done in AR and VR and mixed reality, particularly in terms of the devices or headsets, to make sure they're comfortable to wear and you don't look weird. But I think that should be viewed as part of a human factors story. How do we improve the human factors and usability as opposed to just a 5G story? And if I may just widen it a little bit, I think the 5G Creates story, I hope, will cover more on streaming, because I think the distribution side with 5G higher speed and capacity needs more attention. Certainly other countries are looking at streaming in a bigger way, and we can see the success perhaps of some of the streaming services during lockdown, whether it's Disney or otherwise. So I think we need to concentrate on a bit more how do streaming and 5G fit together as well.
I think that's right. A couple of experiences of working with us, I think, where the latency really makes a difference to the experience, the human factors, as you said, to these things. So I remember doing going and doing a demo which involved making me into an emergency doctor in an A&E department with a set of goggles on, and I'm very sad to tell you that the patient did bleed to death before I worked out what was going to happen. So it was a very interesting, and I think highly plausible use case for how do you train people in safety and mission critical activities where there's danger involved, where you want to try and do things the first time at least without actually killing anybody or putting somebody's life at risk. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing that we saw and we've seen increasingly is in the West Midlands and in other sites, deployment of 5G connected ambulances for remote triage, and putting the emergency doctor, the stroke specialist, or whoever it happens to be in the hospital, effectively right in the cab, into the with the same line of sight, vision, and capability as the paramedic. So you're doing that remote triage, which I think can make a massive difference to outcomes. And I've seen several demonstrations of that, and I think we're moving towards that being a real thing sooner than we might think. So just to quickly touch on the poll which has been running in the background, which asked about barriers or challenges to commercialization success. So we got delays from COVID, not very popular, but did get a vote. We got commercial companies' time investment, scored 10 votes, 15 each for general funding and commercial company investment. But actually, the clear winner is the need for more clear use cases. And I think that it is true. You know, for people to adopt technology, they need their imaginations to be stimulated and people to understand that this technology is coming out of the lab very fast now, and there are real use cases. There are lots of them, and if you look on uk5g.org website, you'll find a ton of video of people talking about their trials and their use cases that they've experienced, and increasingly talking about how they commercialize those. So I think we're definitely moving in the right direction. But Mike's right, we need to continue to do more trials. So I think the poll is a really interesting tool in that. Do continue to vote, and we'll come back to the results at the end. Any comments on the poll from the panel? Or are we happy to leave it there?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, well, we'll come back to it probably. And so let's go back into a couple more questions. So Mike, on the question of, you mentioned in passing softwareization. Where is the UK in that market? Does it help or hinder the UK as these radio networks and core networks become more virtualized, more softwareized as we go along? And is that are we moving towards widespread deployment of that, or are we still in the early stages?
Well, I think we're in the early stages. So first of all, the strengths. I think the UK's got research strengths in our universities and with our key businesses. I think we've also got strengths when it comes to the deployment of innovative services early. This could include design, this could include security, this could even include the regulation of softwareization pieces. So this is how do you extend the range of toolkits, or the tools rather, whether you can make a bigger difference. So I think in Open RAN, I could imagine that we will be providing some software to some of the Open RAN companies. We may not be manufacturing the Open RAN because that might need to have low cost, high volume, but in practice, we may contribute towards the design and maybe the software for Open RAN. For SDN, software-defined networks, we're already doing some work in networks, whether they be fixed, broadband, or mobile, and I think that software capability will be extended. I think there's a case to have a software centre of excellence in the UK, or a telecom centre of excellence for softwareization that could pick up on that strength we've already got and to support Open RAN. I think there's going to be a need for more NFV, network functions virtualization demonstrators, and that might be picked up in the next phase of trials and testbed. I could see network slicing playing a much bigger part for the enterprise customers in particular, maybe campus locations and industrial estates. That's going to require a strong software competence to back it up. And it takes us into another strength, which is not always talked about, which is the area of orchestration and network management. And traditionally, the UK has had real strengths in that area. We were the founders of the TM Forum. But in addition to that, we've had lots of software companies that have been in that orchestration or network management space. We may need to blend some of the university skills with businesses in a different way. So help the spin-outs, for example, in this area, help with the standardization in this area. But to me, that's an underlying strength. And before I finish on networks, I think we should just think about the software skills we have associated with services, whether it be to make sure that content or applications goes across networks well and efficiently, whether we support some of the billing and customer care systems, which are software by and large, or some of the fraud and security that exist in networks where software strengths are strong in the UK. It might sound like a long list, but if I call it softwareization as a whole, please excuse it being a bit of a long list. And it's an area where we could do more work on standards, on certification, testing, and maybe in conjunction with a longer-term R&D program. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. You and Peter have both mentioned security as being important factors in this. Ben, what's the program doing in the area of security? I know you probably can't say an awful lot on it, but just could you just explain to the audience what sorts of things we're involved in?
Yeah, so we obviously work with all of the trials that we've got to kind of implement the highest security standards. We have technical experts who work within the team, who go and advise and support trials on sort of supporting that. I mean, security in many ways kind of can go hand in hand with the kind of questions around telecom supply chain. So I think a lot of there's a lot of interest in kind of supporting that sort of early R&D, looking at sort of building the UK capability in terms of providing as much of that supply chain as possible to kind of sort of make sure that we've got the kind of capability here and can be sure that the networks are secure and robust.
Absolutely, and I mean, I know we work very closely with the main security agencies in the UK as well to make sure that we're giving the best possible advice to our trialists, and that also we also require our trialists to contribute back to that canon of knowledge about security as well. So it's obviously a key thing, and I think, Mike, we've with 5G we've changed the nature of the network, right? So there is not just. It isn't just like another G in that sense. It's we've softwareized the network. We've changed its the number of attack surfaces and the types of attack vectors that might go for us as well. But I think generally we're doing a lot of work in that area, and we expect to keep on doing more. And I believe there's also a new working group of UK 5G, which is focused on security. That's right, isn't it, Mike?
That's correct. We've within UK 5G, which I'm on the steering board for, we've got several groups, but the security is one of the newest ones because I think it was realised that there was a gap there. We had a meeting this morning also to say, should we look at more of the connected car space, because you could imagine special requirements for security in the connected car environment, which is in line with some of the things that Peter's already done.
On that, and moving on from there, I think in terms of other sectors, I've started to see and had some approaches from financial services players, people who are, in particular, insurance companies, interested in 5G from the perspective of what services it's enabling that the insurance industry is interested in. It's a whole area that doesn't get a lot of press, but it's actually something which they're tracking very closely now. So exactly the point about connected vehicles, or especially when they become autonomous. Who's responsible if there's an accident, and how does insurance adapt for that world as we get more immersive and more connected experiences? What other sectors that we haven't discussed today do you, other than that you could foresee trials needed in the future? Again, open question. Anybody shout.
If I can try one, I think health and care is an enormous one that we need to treat with care and sensitivity, of course. But if we think about how we may be less inclined because of COVID to see our doctor face to face, we might want to do it down the line. If we think about who do we trust when it comes to online advice, we need some special security in that area. If we have to see the doctor via video, we want a high speed, low latency, and make sure that we can advise down the line. I think the appetite to go into hospitals or GPs has probably been reduced over the last few months. So I think we need to do more in that health and care area, whether it's faster access to patient records or quicker delivery of apps, or maybe better support for things like e-pharmacy. I could see a lot of scope to do more in that area. I think the work we've done to date, particularly in Liverpool, was more kind of local based, more from a care point of view. But I think we ought to revisit this from a broader industry point of view.
And Mike, what about logistics specifically, and the role of 5G in that, and how maybe the roles of the various players in the logistics market, SIs, etc. How's that going to change with 5G? Do you expect to see a significant impact?
I think it'll depend on the speed of 5G network rollout first. Most logistics companies tend to be very early adopters, but they do things based on the widest coverage at pretty low cost. However, there is no doubt that some of the leading logistics road companies have high levels of tech, whether it's 3G or 4G or even Wi-Fi, even broadcast in their cabs. And it's a natural progression for them to go to 5G at some point. But it will be conditional on coverage internationally. And as you know, most of the coverage that does exist globally is still 2G. It's not even 4G. So I think it may have high coverage dependencies, but they will take the latest and greatest when it's available.
So I think that's interesting, and I agree with your analysis. I think that there's the logistics, as with telecoms networks, there is always this sort of last mile and the sort of wider journey, which you might think of different coverage options for those.
Yes.
And in particular within ports and borders, I think that's a very specific and interesting area, which we might see more of, especially as we get into the whole conversations about free ports and new arrangements with our trading partners.
Well, I think the ports tend to be congested in other ways, less congested by communications, but congested by space. So already Singapore have got a major trial looking at 5G to make their port not just a Singapore hub, but a major port for South Asia. And I think we could look at some of the bigger ports in the UK and see how could communications help with both the arrival of ships and the departure of ships, not just the loading at the port itself. And communications could certainly help with sensing, and we could certainly see much more in the way of IoT. Some of the ports already have some IoT, particularly at Felixstowe, but I think the bigger ports probably need some special attention. That's probably best done not by government, but by big systems integrators or consultants, and then taking lessons from the bigger ports around the world. But there aren't many that have really gone hell for leather when it comes to 5G yet, with the exception of Singapore.
Yeah, I think I also heard about Rotterdam doing some work, but we've also had some conversations with a number of the UK ports, and indeed I'm expecting one or two bids. So I probably should leave it there. But Peter, you're seeing obviously these vehicles being tested on your tracks, because it's, as you said, it's not just production consumer vehicles or race cars. You're also testing those kinds of vehicles as well. Are you seeing interest in new kinds of cases in those areas?
Yeah, I think we've had quite a few through, and it's been an interesting conversation. So you talked about the ambulance. We did an ambulance trial as well there. That's interesting. The car-to-car stuff, we routinely now do Google Duo conferences at 100 miles an hour, which is great because it's peer-to-peer. It doesn't go out to the internet. Data streaming, we talked about. An interesting one was Air Sea Rescue, where you fly the cell on a helicopter, and there's a cell flying around looking for lost people with devices. Remote driving's an interesting one as well. So repositioning vehicles at the end of a car sharing thing, or just low speed maneuvers to get you out of trouble. That's interesting. But I think behind all of this is we try to explain to our guys on site. If you take a use case, you just boil it back to what it's really doing. I mean, the smart ambulance one was high definition video, pixel by pixel, between a remote ambulance and a consultant with patient data. So at the end of the day, you're streaming high definition video and you're streaming live data. So if you take those two elements of the 5G part and then apply that to your own use case, then suddenly you start coming up with other ideas, such as the remote driving. It's high-speed video, real-time, with data backwards and forwards. So you have a closed-loop system. So again, it's just developing that use case and see what can we next do with it. How can we do this, and how can we adapt it into something else, and how do we get excitement of these characteristics, the high definition, the low latency, and the high bandwidth.
Okay, that's I think that's really true. I'm going to go back on Mike's point on the health and care options as well, and come back to Ben. In terms of, how has COVID changed our needs for health and care? How's it impacting both us as individuals and the NHS? Well, obviously we're talking in the UK, so we're interested in our flagship NHS service, but obviously there'll be implications worldwide. And I know we've got a global audience today, so we shouldn't be too parochial. But what are you seeing in terms of the sorts of projects people are wanting to do with health and care? And are we seeing an acceleration of that? Are we getting into a dialogue with NHSX, etc.? What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think as with so much, I think COVID is accelerating trends that were already there rather than per se creating new ones. So the kind of rise of these sort of the need for secure online consultations and kind of remote healthcare, I think is just going to become even more important. And ultimately, I guess the as you touched on earlier, the potential for robotic surgery becomes even more possible with 5G in the future. So I think that's another area where we're interested in seeing what happens on a kind of more immediate and human level. So one of the most exciting projects for me that we've supported so far is the Liverpool 5G project, because it was led by Sensor City, and it included the Liverpool University and various other SMEs. But it was looking predominantly at sort of using a mesh network and 5G to deliver connectivity to some quite deprived parts of Liverpool, and supporting devices like push-to-talk devices, which allow carers to talk to each other to kind of combat loneliness. And we know that even during the pandemic, so our trial is actually stopped there, but actually during the trial, those devices are continuing to be used by carers who are obviously in even more challenging circumstances than they were before. And also, that trial looked at things like the potential for monitoring patients remotely, hydration levels, sort of videoing of patients to check that they were taking their medications correctly and things. So allowing older people and vulnerable groups to kind of stay at home for longer, which, you can see the importance of that during lockdown even more. And I know I think there's also a care home in Breckside there that was had their Wi-Fi network that was supported partly through the project, and that's continues to be in place and supporting residents throughout the COVID pandemic. So I think that was a really exciting way in which you can see that some actually quite advanced tech but simple ideas sort of really can improve lives through the kind of health and care sector. So hope to see more of those through 5G Create and more kind of ideas coming through future competitions.
I notice we've got a few more questions, a couple of them quite technical ones. So I'm going to come to Mike on a couple of those. So we had a question somewhere, and I've now lost it, but I'm going to try and find it again, about uplink. And where's it gone? So suddenly there are a lot more questions than I thought there were. Let me see.
It was on satellite uplink, I think, Tony.
It was, yes. So how's that going to help, was the question.
So I think the start point with satellite, if it's a new mode, needs to have international spectrum consistently allocated. The idea of doing satellite just for the UK is nonsense. We need international agreement on the spectrum. That's key because you want interoperability and you want devices that are cost effective. If you don't have it, the cost will go up and it won't be usable by many. The possibility of doing satellite uplink to add value to the system, I think, is there within the reach of the research next steps. Certainly there's talk of it being used in the USA early on with the new dish network in the States. But I think we need to see how it evolves. But generally, spectrum consistency needed internationally. Secondly, economies of scale are a factor, and it's more likely to be deployed once the research and development is complete. And
there was a supplementary on that about 5G non-terrestrial network, NTN, satellite service provider entering the game as an MNO. Does that affect the UK operator market? I'm assuming this is talking, well, I'm not sure. Is this talking about the sort of Elon Musk approach to satellite provision of networks?
So there are some geostationary and some LEO-stationary satellite constellations. The choice that we have for broadband will increase in time with satellite, but at the moment they're not within the reach of most householders. So I think we'll have more satellite choice. My point earlier on about satellite, though, was how will they work with terrestrial in the same way as Wi-Fi works with terrestrial cellular. So I think what we need is to see how the research will link these together to provide more choices for everybody. And some will take time, some will never make it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. That's clear. There's a few more questions. And again, it's a similar question on OneWeb and the investment in that. So I'll assume we've answered that one. There's also a question about banning Chinese vendors. As government officials, we can't comment on that at the moment. Obviously, you can read what you like in the papers, and there will be announcements on some of that soon. So I don't propose that we get into that on the discussion now. There are a whole load of other questions which I've just come across. So Chancellor's expected to announce £2 billion fund for consumers to invest in insulation for short-term spending, long-term value and CO2 reduction. Are we ready for this? I'm not sure. All right, are we ready for the same for private networks to support our telecoms industry? There's some sort of voucher scheme to provide networks. I'm not sure really where we are with that. I think there is a community angle on all of this for community coverage or rural coverage in remote locations, and I think that's all part of the rural gigabit program to invest in that. Ben, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the rural gigabit connectivity initiative, sort of use of vouchers, and that was a kind of 5 billion commitment, so sort of in that ballpark. But yeah, no, nothing more than is already in the public domain.
Okay. There's also some things about latency and how you deliver. I guess the question on latency is, if it's a critical network function or feature or capability, then how do you guarantee it in hybrid network environments and so on? Peter, probably you're as a end user business in this case, what happens when if the network doesn't perform, and how do you guarantee a service level in those sort of mission critical or safety and engineering critical environments, and how's that going to work?
It's a real tricky one. I think we're in the very early stages. So obviously we've been testing some of the solutions out that we have done with Blue Wireless, but I think long term, I think we'll still have a recorded backup, if you like, something to go back on. I think we're starting to look at interoperating equipment across the site. So, for example, a simulator driving an engine test rig, and there you really do have to have very good control and reliability. But for us, it's early stages. We'll wait and see what evolves from the systems, and it's interesting cutting those last little bits of fiber and relying on the wireless to actually do the job for us. So it's to be explored for us, I think.
Terrific. And I think that's that for me, that's probably going to be a very critical factor for industry rolling out 5G, is that they need to know they can get a guaranteed level of service, and that that they've got some recourse if that's not happening. So I think the private network space is going to be a mix of where people do what you've done and effectively invest in your own infrastructure, and others where people buy into a slice of a mobile network operator's network. I think it's Philip Marnick from Ofcom recently said that this is the first thing about 5G is it's the first time that other people other than mobile network operators can build and operate their own mobile networks in a way they've never really been able to do before. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of all this. I think we're probably getting to the point where we need to start winding up, and I just signaling to our to Mike Barrell to see if he'd like to come and help us to start winding up. But I'll ask the panelists for just a few closing remarks, if you like, on the conversation today, and things they'd like to leave us with in terms of lasting impressions. So I'll start with you, Peter.
Well, as a complete outsider, 18 months ago, we just had one macro cell on site, and that was it. We had no connectivity at all. So we've built and deployed a network. I think what's been really good is sharing the lessons that we've learned, what we've found out, educating ourselves on what 5G is, and for a lot of the time, it was holes in the ground and fiber. And so having seen that mature, but now sort of moving on, and with folks like Densera or long-term operators, trying to see what that can become as a test bed, trying to remain impartial as well, and offering a proof of concept site for folks, for example, 5G Create Consortia. And it's an interesting future, and we see where it goes. There's an awful lot of change going on in the industry that we're involved in, with propulsion and safety as well as connectivity. So there's lots of benefits to be realized, I think.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And I think it's incredibly welcome that businesses like yours have stepped into this space with gusto and put their money where their interest is as well. Ben, so just reflections on what we've talked about, and also perhaps little hints of what might be next.
Yeah, I mean, probably my main reflection is it's been lovely to have this chat and to be able to do this. And I think that's the kind of one thing that's kind of been heartening to see within government amidst everything is actually just how well the telecom sector has kind of held up, and it's been able to enable this kind of thing to carry on happening throughout lockdown. So I think that's been great. And as we come out and move on, I think it's going to be really important that we get these kind of research and development projects up and running, and sort of keep the momentum that we've built so far on 5G. I'll probably just end with a quick plug for our 5G Create competition, which we had one window which we had a lot of interest for, which was fantastic. But there's another one which ends at the end of July on the 27th. So there will be further funding available. So if you've got interesting ideas on how to use 5G, do look into that and do bid in. Okay, thank you.
I think we may have lost Mike Short to the perils of the internet. Obviously, the whole internet hasn't shut down because we're still able to talk, but it may be his local connection, I suspect. And I see Mike Barrell's nudging us towards the close. So I'll just, from my perspective, I'll just say a couple of words. Been a fascinating conversation with really engaging and interesting people who are clearly deeply embedded in this subject area. I hope the audience has enjoyed it. A quick reflection, last look at the poll. Again, need for more clear use cases is still the leading vote, with commercial backing is also a key part of the how do we overcome that barrier. I think the last thing I'll say is the shift to online for these kinds of discussions, I think has been obviously for me, a very positive one. I've been able to do a lot more of them with a lot less expense, a lot less travel time and downtime. Obviously, it's great to sit with people with a cup of coffee in your hand and chat, but the ability to cover the ground quickly has been immense. And I think that one of the things we will see in the immersive space, when we talked about immersive use cases earlier, I think this is a space where immersive is really going to count. And I don't necessarily mean putting on a pair of goggles. I just mean the way that we manage these events is definitely becoming much more professional, and we will see a lot better experiences of this. And we have to see it in all of our professional lives, because this is how we spend our days now. So it's got to be fun. So Mike, back to you. Thank you very much.
No, look, I'm not a very good mic replacement here, but I believe the other mic is in need of 5G because his internet dropped out. So everything makes sense in the long run. But yeah, thanks, Mike, Ben, Peter, and Tony for chairing it. It's the difference since we ran our event last year and now in terms of the amount of real content everybody's got to talk about is staggering. I mean, we were struggling, I must say, last year with use cases we could really get our teeth into, and now it's just non-stop content. It can just keep going and going. So thanks very much. Thank you everybody for participating also in the questions. It's much more interesting to have some real-time input going on as well. And look forward to the next one, and hopefully everybody joining us at the start of September as well.